The year was 1871, and the small Canadian town of Lindsay, Ontario, was shrouded in morning mist as young Pearl Taylor stood on her family's porch, gazing at the horizon. Born into a strict religious household, Pearl's bright eyes and restless spirit already hinted at a woman who would never be content with the life society had prescribed for her. At just 16, she possessed a fierce intelligence and stubborn independence that both troubled and impressed her God-fearing parents. "Pearl, come inside. Your father's waiting to take you to school," her mother called from the doorway, her voice tinged with the familiar worry that had become a constant presence whenever she looked at her daughter. Pearl sighed, turning reluctantly from the view of distant hills and endless possibilities. The Taylor household was a place of rigid rules and expectations. A girl should be modest, obedient, and eventually become a dutiful wife and mother. But even then, Pearl dreamed of something more. Education was Pearl's temporary escape, and she excelled at the boarding school her parents had carefully selected. It was there, among other young ladies being groomed for proper society, that Pearl first glimpsed a different path when a traveling theater company performed in the nearby town. Among the performers was a dashing young man named Frank Hart, charming, worldly, and exciting in a way that made the young women whisper behind their fans. While the other girls merely swooned, 17-year-old Pearl took action. When the company departed a week later, Pearl Taylor went with them, having eloped with Frank Hart in a scandal that would haunt her proper family for years to come. "You'll regret this foolishness," her father had warned as she packed her small bag. "The world isn't kind to women who defy convention." Pearl had simply smiled, the certainty of youth burning bright within her. "Then perhaps it's time someone changed those conventions, father." She couldn't have known then how prophetic and painful those words would prove to be. The early years of Pearl's marriage stripped away her romantic notions. Like autumn winds tear leaves from trees, Frank Hart turned out to be not only a mediocre performer, but also a heavy drinker with a gambler's empty pockets and a quick temper. Their travels took them through mining towns and settlements across the Midwest, each one seedier than the last as Frank's prospects dwindled by. 1893, Pearl was 22, disillusioned, and trapped in a cycle of poverty and abuse. The fresh-faced Canadian schoolgirl had been replaced by a hardened young woman who had learned painful lessons about survival in a world that offered few options to women without means or protection. It was during a rare moment of calm that Pearl found herself in Chicago, where the World's Columbian Exposition was transforming the city into a showcase of innovation and possibility. Frank had disappeared on another drinking spree, leaving Pearl with nothing but bruises and an empty purse. Desperate and hungry, she wandered into the fairgrounds, slipping past a distracted ticket collector. What she saw that day changed the course of her life. On one of the exposition's many stages stood Annie Oakley, the renowned sharpshooter of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Dressed in fringed buckskin, her rifle held with casual confidence, Annie commanded the crowd's attention as she performed seemingly impossible shots. Pearl stood transfixed, watching a woman who had carved her own place in a man's world through skill, determination, and sheer nerve. "She makes her own way," whispered a woman beside Pearl. "Isn't beholden to any man. Earns more than most fellas, too." The seed was planted. As Pearl watched Annie split a playing card edge-on at 30 paces, something hardened within her. A determination that would later be described by newspapers across America as either admirable grit or dangerous defiance, depending on who was doing the writing. When Frank returned 3 days later, Pearl was gone, not running home in defeat as she had considered so many times before, but heading west with the meager funds she had earned washing dishes at a fair concession stand. The next few years were a blur of hardship and determination. As Pearl made her way through mining camps and frontier towns, she worked whatever jobs a woman could find: cook, laundress, seamstress, and occasionally entertainer in the rough saloons where men paid good money to hear a woman sing. Her clear, strong voice earned her better pay than washing dishes. Though the environment came with its own dangers, it was in one such establishment in Arizona, territory, that Pearl first crossed the invisible line between respectable employment and what society deemed fallen. The Bucket of Blood Saloon in Phoenix was no place for the faint of heart, but it paid better than most, especially for women willing to provide company to lonely miners after their performances. Pearl, now using the name Hart, though she and Frank had long since parted ways, made her choice with clear-eyed pragmatism. "You'll make 3 times what I pay you for singing," the saloon owner told her bluntly. "Pretty thing like you won't lack for admirers." Pearl's laugh was hollow. "Seems to me a woman's body is all she's ever allowed to trade, one way or another. At least this way, I set the price." And so Pearl Hart joined the ranks of the soiled doves, women who lived in the shadows of frontier society, necessary but despised, desired but discarded. Yet even here, Pearl's fierce independence set her apart. She learned to handle a gun, insisted on choosing her clients, and saved every dollar she could, dreaming of someday owning her own business. By 1899, Pearl had worked her way through the vice districts of Tucson and Globe, eventually landing in the mining town of Mammoth, Arizona. Though still young at 28, years of hard living had left their mark. Her once soft features had sharpened, her hands had grown calloused, and her eyes held the wary look of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelty. Yet something of the dreamer remained, evident in how she would sometimes pause to watch the sunset paint the desert mountains, or how she still read voraciously whenever she could get her hands on newspapers or books. It was this paradox, the hardened survivor with the hidden soul of a poet, that would later fascinate the American public when her name hit headlines across the nation. Pearl's life might have continued in this vein, an unremarkable struggle. Among thousands of similar women's stories, lost to history, had it not been for a letter that arrived from her sister in Canada in the spring of 1899. The dusty postmaster handed it to her with raised eyebrows. Letters from respectable places rarely came for women like Pearl. She tore it open on the spot, her face growing paler with each line she read. "Bad news?" the postmaster inquired, curiosity overcoming propriety. Pearl looked up, her eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "My mother is dying. Consumption. They don't expect her to last the summer." For all her rebellions and hardships, Pearl had never stopped loving her family, though pride and shame had kept her from contacting them for years. The thought of never seeing her mother again, of never receiving forgiveness for her youthful defiance, was unbearable. "I have to go to her," Pearl whispered, more to herself than to the postmaster. "I have to make it right before it's too late." But a journey from Arizona to Ontario required money, far more than Pearl had managed to save despite her years of work. The stage fare alone would cost months of earnings, and she would need additional funds to survive the journey and perhaps support herself while visiting her ailing mother. Desperation has driven people to extremes throughout history, and Pearl Hart was about to join their ranks. As she walked back to her small rented room, her mind raced with possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. Borrowing the money was impossible. No bank would lend to a woman like her, and she had no friends wealthy enough to help. That evening, as Pearl sat on her narrow bed calculating and recalculating how long it would take to save the needed amount, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Joseph Boot, a 50-something miner who had occasionally sought her company when he came to town. "Evening, Miss Pearl," he said, removing his dusty hat. "Thought I'd stop by and see if you might join me for supper." Pearl almost refused. She was in no mood for company. but then reconsidered. Boot wasn't like most of her clients. He was gentle, respectful even, and he liked to talk about his dreams of striking it rich. More importantly, he knew the territory better than most, having prospected throughout Arizona for years. "I'd be pleased to join you, Joe," she said, reaching for her shawl. Over a simple meal at the town's only decent restaurant, Pearl shared her dilemma. Boot listened sympathetically, his weathered face thoughtful. "Seems to me," he said finally, "there's plenty of money traveling through these parts, just not in our pockets." Pearl looked at him sharply. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Boot leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The stage that runs from Florence to Globe carries the payroll for the mines twice a month. Next runs in 3 days. 2 passengers at most this time of year. 1 driver, no guard." Pearl felt her heart race. "You can't possibly be suggesting ... I'm not suggesting anything," Boot replied carefully. "Just making an observation about where money might be found quickly by someone in desperate need." They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, but a seed had been planted, one that would bloom into a plan as wild and desperate as the territory itself. 3 days later, on May 30th, 1899, a stagecoach departed Florence, Arizona, carrying mail, the mine payroll, and 2 passengers. It was headed for Globe, following a lonely route through the Sonoran Desert, a journey that would soon secure Pearl Hart's place in Western history, not as a fallen woman, but as one of the last stagecoach robbers of the American frontier. Want to know what happens next? Don't forget to like and subscribe, and join us for Chapter 2, where Pearl Hart takes her destiny into her own hands. Welcome back to our extraordinary tale of Pearl Hart. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The morning of May 30th, 1899, dawned clear and hot over the Arizona territory. Pearl Hart woke before sunrise in the small canvas tent she and Joseph Boot had pitched the previous night, about a half-mile from the stage road between Florence and Globe. Her sleep had been fitful, plagued by dreams of her dying mother and nightmares of hangman's nooses. "Having second thoughts?" Boot asked, noticing her troubled expression as he stoked their small, smokeless fire. Pearl shook her head firmly. "No, I made my decision." She reached for the bundle of men's clothing they had procured, loose trousers, a cotton shirt, a vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that would hide her features. "What time is the stage due?" "Should pass this stretch around noon," Boot replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "We've got time to go over the plan once more." The plan was simple, perhaps too simple. They would block the road with fallen branches, forcing the stage to stop. Disguised as men, they would approach with weapons drawn, Boot with his old Colt revolver, Pearl with a .38 caliber pistol she had purchased years ago for protection. They would take the money, nothing else, and disappear into the rugged hills where Boot knew hidden trails and abandoned mining claims that could serve as temporary shelter. "Remember," Boot cautioned as Pearl changed into her disguise behind. "A screen of brush, no shooting unless absolutely necessary. And try to deepen your voice when you speak." Pearl emerged, tucking her hair beneath the hat. The transformation was remarkable, with her slender frame hidden beneath loose clothing and her face shadowed by the hat brim. She could easily pass for a young man from a distance. "How do I look?" she asked, deliberately lowering her voice. Boot nodded approvingly, like a proper young desperado. "Let's hope the driver doesn't look too close." As noon approached, they positioned themselves behind a large boulder overlooking a bend in the road. Boot had already arranged a barricade of branches across the narrow track, not enough to completely block passage, but sufficient to force the driver to slow down and possibly stop to clear the way. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as they waited, the minutes stretching like hours. Pearl felt sweat trickle down her back, but it wasn't just from the heat. For all her bravado and determination, she was terrified. This wasn't just another line crossed in a life of increasing desperation. This was a hanging offense. What if they resist? She whispered to Boot. They won't, he assured her, though his own voice lacked conviction. Stage drivers are instructed not to risk lives over money. He'll hand over the strongbox, and will be gone before he knows what happened. The distant sound of hooves and creaking wheels silenced their conversation. Pearl's heart hammered against her ribs as she gripped her pistol, her palms slick with sweat. Steady now, Boot murmured. Remember why we're doing this. The image of her mother's face, lined with illness and disappointment, flashed through Pearl's mind. She nodded grimly and pulled her bandana up over the lower half of her face. The stagecoach came into view, a cloud of dust trailing behind it as the driver urged his team around the bend. It was a typical Concord coach, sturdy and weather-beaten, pulled by 4 horses. From their vantage point, Pearl could see the driver, a grizzled man of about 50, and what appeared to be 2 passengers inside. When the driver spotted the barricade, he pulled back on the reins with a shout of surprise. The coach lurched to a stop, and the man set the brake before climbing down to investigate the obstruction. That's our cue, Boot whispered, rising from their hiding place. They scrambled down the rocky slope, approaching from the rear of the coach where the driver couldn't see them. Pearl's legs felt wooden, her movements mechanical as she followed Boot's lead. This was the moment, their last chance to turn back, to abandon this mad scheme. But the thought of her mother dying without, seeing her daughter one last time, steeled Pearl's resolve. She raised her pistol as they rounded the coach. Hands up, Boot shouted, his voice startling the driver who was examining the branches. The man spun around, his eyes widening at the sight of 2 armed figures. Inside the coach, a passenger appeared, out nervously. What's the meaning of this? The driver demanded, though he raised his hands slowly. This is a hold-up, Pearl declared, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. We want the strongbox and any valuables. Nobody needs to get hurt. The driver's gaze flickered between them, clearly assessing his chances. Pearl stepped forward, pressing her advantage. Don't try anything foolish, she warned. Just hand over the money. Open the coach door, Boot instructed the driver. Tell your passengers to come out slowly. A driver complied, revealing 2 well-dressed gentlemen who emerged blinking into the harsh sunlight. One was young, perhaps in his 20s, while the other was older with the prosperous look of a businessman or mine owner. Gentlemen, Pearl addressed them, maintaining her disguised voice. Please remove any valuables and place them on the ground. Watches, wallets, jewelry. The younger man seemed paralyzed with fear, but the older one narrowed his eyes, studying Pearl with uncomfortable intensity. You're no man, he said suddenly. That's a woman's voice. Pearl felt a jolt of panic, but recovered quickly, pressing her gun more firmly in his direction. Shut up and do as you're told. Your money or your life, sir. It's a simple choice. The businessman's face registered shock, then a curious blend of outrage and fascination. A female bandit? Well, I never... And you never will again if you don't hand over your wallet, Pearl snapped, her nerves fraying. While Boot kept his gun trained on the driver, Pearl collected about $430 from the passengers and the mail pouch. A substantial sum in 1899, more than enough for her journey to Canada and months of living expenses beyond. Now, gentlemen, please remove your boots, she instructed. Our boots? The younger passenger squeaked in disbelief. Yes, your boots. And you, driver, unhitch 2 of your horses. We can't have you following us too quickly. The men complied. Reluctantly, looking ridiculous in their stocking feet. Pearl almost laughed at the sight, feeling a strange exhilaration replacing her earlier fear. There was power in this, perhaps the first real power she had ever wielded. Once they had secured the money and delayed any immediate pursuit, Pearl and Boot mounted their waiting horses and prepared to flee. But before they departed, Pearl did something that would later captivate newspaper readers across America. She returned $1 to each of her victims. "For food and lodging," she explained, tossing the coins at their feet. "I'm not completely heartless." With that, she and Boot galloped away, leaving behind 3 bewildered men with a story that would soon spread across the Chi territory. Their initial escape went smoothly. Boot led them through rugged terrain where horses could barely follow, let alone a pursuing posse. By nightfall, they had reached one of his old prospecting camps, little more than a crude shelter against a cliff face, but well hidden and equipped with basic necessities. "We did it," Pearl breathed as they counted their take by lantern light. "I can't believe we actually did it." Boot nodded, but his expression remained worried. "The hard part's just beginning, Pearl. They'll be looking for us." "They're looking for 2 men," she countered. "I'll change back to women's clothing. We'll separate for a while. You head north, I'll go east toward New Mexico territory." But Joseph Boot, for all his initial bravado about the robbery, proved to have less stomach for life as a fugitive than Pearl. His hands shook as he recounted the money, and he jumped at every sound from the desert night. "I don't like it," he muttered. "That businessman got a good look at us. And a female stagecoach robber. That's going to draw attention." He was right, of course. By the following day, word of the unusual robbery had spread to every settlement. Within 50 miles, wanted posters were hastily printed, offering a substantial reward for Pearl Hart, female bandit, and her male accomplice. Against Pearl's advice, they decided to stay together, making their way slowly toward the New Mexico border. But luck was not on their side. 3 days after the robbery, they stopped at a small spring to water their horses. Exhausted from constant vigilance and travel, they fell asleep in the afternoon shade. They awoke to find themselves surrounded by a posse from Pinal County, led by Sheriff William Truman himself. "Well, well," the sheriff drawled, looking down at Pearl with undisguised curiosity. The lady bandit herself. "You've caused quite a stir, Mrs. Hart." Pearl sat up slowly, her hand instinctively moving toward her hidden pistol. But the sheriff's deputy was quicker, kicking it away before she could reach it. Boot, to his credit, didn't even try to resist, raising his hands in immediate surrender. "It's Miss, not Mrs.," Pearl corrected the sheriff, meeting his gaze defiantly. "And I had my reasons." "Don't they all?" Truman replied dryly. "You can explain those reasons to the judge." As the posse bound their hands and prepared to take them back to Florence, Pearl felt a strange mix of relief and resignation. The desperate gamble had failed. She would not see her mother again. Yet alongside the bitter disappointment was an odd sensation of anticipation, as if a new chapter was beginning rather than ending. She couldn't have known how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. The journey back to Florence was uncomfortable, but not cruel. Sheriff Truman, despite his professional demeanor, treated Pearl with a certain gruff courtesy that surprised her. The other posse members regarded her with undisguised fascination, clearly torn between disapproval of her crime and amazement at her audacity. "Never thought I'd be arresting a woman for stagecoach robbery," one deputy remarked as they made camp on the first night. "That's a new one for the books." "Times are changing," Pearl replied with more confidence than she felt. "Women are doing all sorts of things they weren't supposed to do before. Robbing stages wasn't exactly what the suffragists had in mind, I reckon," the sheriff commented dryly. Pearl laughed despite herself. "Perhaps not, but desperate times call for desperate measures." "And what made your time so desperate, Miss Hart?" Truman asked, studying her across the campfire. So Pearl told him about her dying mother, her need to travel east, the lack of legitimate opportunities for a woman to earn sufficient money quickly. She didn't mention her background as a saloon girl and prostitute, though she suspected the sheriff had guessed as much from her manner and history. When she finished, Truman was silent for a long moment. "That's a sad tale," he finally said, "but it won't save you from jail. The law's the law." "I never expected it would," Pearl replied, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders against the desert night's chill. "But sometimes it helps to have someone understand why." By the time they reached Florence, news of Pearl's capture had spread far beyond Arizona. Journalists from Phoenix, Tucson, and even as far as Denver had descended on the small town, eager for a glimpse of the notorious female bandit. When the posse rode in, Pearl was startled to find herself the center of attention in a way she had never experienced before. "There she is," someone shouted as they approached the jailhouse. "The lady stagecoach robber." A crowd had gathered, men, women, and wide-eyed children, all straining for a look at this curiosity. Flash bulbs popped as photographers captured her disheveled appearance for newspapers across the country. "Miss Hart, why did you do it?" called one reporter. "Are you proud of breaking the law?" shouted another. "Did you really return money to your victims?" a third voice questioned. Pearl straightened her spine and lifted her chin, meeting their stares with dignity despite her bound hands and dust-covered clothes. In that moment, something shifted within her. A recognition that while she might be a prisoner, she was also suddenly visible in a way that society rarely allowed women like her to be. As Sheriff Truman led her into the jailhouse, away from the prying eyes and shouted questions, Pearl Hart began her transformation from desperate criminal to Western legend, a journey as improbable as it was uniquely American. What fate awaits Pearl Hart in the halls of justice? Will she find redemption or face the hangman's noose? Join us for the dramatic conclusion in Chapter 3. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch the final chapter of this remarkable true story. Welcome to the final chapter of Pearl Hart's extraordinary journey. If you've enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more fascinating tales of the Wild West. The Florence County Jail had never housed a female prisoner quite like Pearl Hart. From the moment she was placed in her cell, hastily modified to provide some privacy from the male inmates, it became clear that this would be no ordinary case. Journalists clamored for interviews, bribing guards for a chance to speak with the lady bandit. Pearl, quickly grasping the power of public interest, proved remarkably adept at playing to her audience. She crafted a narrative that, while based on truth, carefully emphasized the elements most likely to elicit sympathy: her dying mother, her limited options as a woman, and her essentially non-violent approach to the robbery. "I never intended to harm anyone," she told a reporter from the Arizona Star, her blue eyes wide with calculated sincerity. "A woman must do what she can in this world to survive. Men have so many opportunities denied to us." The reporter dutifully noted her words, adding his own flourishes about her surprisingly refined manner and delicate features that belie her desperate actions. Similar stories appeared in newspapers across the country, often accompanied by sketches that portrayed Pearl as far more genteel and attractive than her actual appearance after years of hard living got in another cell block. Joseph Boot languished in relative obscurity, largely forgotten by the press in their fascination with his female accomplice. He watched with a mixture of resentment and admiration as Pearl skillfully worked the public's interest to her advantage. Meanwhile, Sheriff Truman faced an unexpected challenge. The local jail wasn't designed to house female prisoners long term, especially one drawing such attention. After a week of increasing disruption, as journalists and curiosity seekers loitered around the jailhouse, the decision was made to transfer Pearl to Tucson to await trial. The journey presented an opportunity that Pearl was quick to seize. As the small party stopped for the night at a way station, she feigned illness, convincing her guards to loosen her restraints. When they momentarily turned their attention elsewhere, she slipped away into the darkness, thought her freedom was short-lived. Less than 2 days later, she was recaptured near the Mexican border, exhausted and hungry. This brief escape, rather than damaging her public image, only added to the growing legend. Newspapers breathlessly recounted how the Lady Bandit had nearly made it to freedom, emphasizing her courage and resourcefulness rather than the foolhardiness of her attempt out. By the time Pearl finally stood trial in November 1899, she had become a national sensation. The small Tucson courtroom was packed with spectators, many of them women who had traveled considerable distances to witness this peculiar spectacle of female outlawry. Pearl did not disappoint. She arrived in court wearing a dress borrowed from a sympathetic jailer's wife, modest but flattering, with her hair arranged in a simple but becoming style. She had carefully rehearsed her testimony, emphasizing her desperate circumstances and maternal devotion. "I had received word that my beloved mother was gravely ill," she told the court, her voice steady despite the occasional well-timed tremor. "As her daughter, I could not bear the thought of her passing without reconciliation between us. I sought honest work, but the wages offered to women, when work can be found at all, would never have allowed me to reach her in time." The all-male jury listened with mixed expressions of skepticism and fascination. The judge, a stern man named Fletcher Davis, seemed less impressed. "Mrs. Hart," he interrupted, "regardless of your motivations, the fact remains that you committed armed robbery, a serious offense that carries severe penalties in this territory." "I understand, Your Honor," Pearl replied. "I do not deny my actions, only ask that the circumstances be considered." The prosecution presented a straightforward case, bolstered by testimony from the stagecoach driver and passengers. The defense, led by a young lawyer who had taken Pearl's case partly for the publicity, focused on her lack of violent history and the unusual pressures that had driven her to crime. As the trial progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Pearl Hart, the fallen woman, the prostitute turned bandit, began to embody larger questions about women's place in society. Local suffragists, initially hesitant to associate with such a controversial figure, started attending the trial, seeing in Pearl's predicament a stark illustration of the limited options available to women without voting rights or equal economic opportunities. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of robbery, but with a recommendation for leniency. Judge Davis, constrained by territorial law, nevertheless sentenced Pearl to 5 years in the Yuma Territorial Prison, a harsh outcome, but less than the maximum penalty. As Pearl was led from the courtroom, a woman in the gallery stood and called out, "Stay strong, sister. Your struggle is our struggle." Pearl looked back, momentarily startled by this unexpected solidarity from a respectable-looking woman she had never met. It was a turning point, the moment when Pearl Hart began to understand that her personal desperation had inadvertently connected her to larger currents of social change. Joseph Boot, tried separately and lacking Pearl's compelling narrative and public support, received a 30-year sentence. The disparity was not lost on observers, many of whom noted the paradox of a woman receiving greater leniency in a legal system that otherwise denied her equal rights. Yuma Territorial Prison, with its forbidding stone walls rising from the scorching desert beside the Colorado River, was one of the most notorious penal institutions in the West. When Pearl arrived in December 1899, she was only the second female inmate in a facility designed exclusively for men. Prison authorities, Unsure how to handle this unusual prisoner, converted a small supply room into a separate cell, providing Pearl with privacy but also intensifying her isolation. The warden, concerned about her safety among the male population, restricted her movement within the prison, effectively placing her in a form of solitary confinement. Yet even here, Pearl's notoriety worked in her favor. Guards treated her with a certain deference, sometimes bringing her books or small comforts not afforded to other prisoners. Journalists continued to seek interviews, which the warden occasionally permitted, seeing value in the positive publicity that Pearl's articulate accounts provided. In these interviews, Pearl began to develop a new persona, less the desperate criminal, more the thoughtful observer of social injustice. She spoke about the conditions that drove women to crime, the lack of educational and employment opportunities, and the double standards that pervaded Western society. "A man may reinvent himself a dozen times in the West," she told one reporter. "He may leave behind mistakes and start anew. A woman carries her past like a brand, visible to all who would judge her." Her words resonated with a growing movement of women fighting for suffrage and equal rights. Without intending it, Pearl Hart had become a symbol, complicated and controversial, but powerful nonetheless. Meanwhile, the territorial governor was receiving letters. Dozens, then hundreds of them, from women's groups, sympathetic citizens, and even some of the region's prominent men, all advocating for Pearl's pardon or reduced sentence. The steady pressure, combined with the practical difficulties of housing a female prisoner in an all-male facility, eventually had an effect. After serving just under 2 years of her sentence, Pearl received news that changed everything. The governor had signed a pardon. The official reason cited was the unusual circumstances of her case and the disproportionate difficulty of her confinement compared to male prisoners. On a warm morning in November 1901, Pearl Hart walked out of Yuma prison a free woman. Waiting journalists peppered her with questions about her plans. "I intend to tell my story," she replied with newfound confidence. "The true story, not just what makes for exciting headlines. And then, perhaps, I'll join those working to ensure other women don't face the same desperate choices I did." True to her word, Pearl briefly joined the lecture circuit, speaking to women's groups about her experiences. She posed for photographs in masculine attire similar to her robbery disguise, playing up the sensational aspects of her story while weaving in serious commentary about women's status in society. But public interest eventually waned, and Pearl, ever restless, moved on. Reports of her later life are fragmented and often contradictory. Some accounts place her in Kansas City, working under an assumed name. Others suggest she joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for a season, trading on her notoriety as the Lady Bandit. A few tantalizing records indicate she may have married a rancher in Arizona and lived quietly under a new identity. What is certain is that Pearl Hart never returned to the Canadian home of her childhood, and no record exists of her reunion with the dying mother whose plight had triggered her desperate crime. Perhaps the illness was less severe than reported, or perhaps Pearl's own story contained elements of justifying fiction. The historical record remains stubbornly incomplete. Joseph Boot, meanwhile, escaped from the Yuma prison after serving just 18 months of his 30-year sentence. Unlike Pearl, he successfully disappeared from public record, presumably fleeing to Mexico or assuming a new identity elsewhere in the vast American West. The stagecoach robbery that made Pearl Hart famous turned out to be one of the last of its kind. Within a few years, automobiles began replacing horse-drawn coaches. Railways expanded throughout the territory, and the classic stagecoach holdup joined the growing mythology of the Wild West, a rapidly fading era, even as Pearl lived through it. By the time Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, Pearl Hart had already become more legend than person. her actual deeds and words less important than what she represented. A woman who had defied convention, broken the law, faced the consequences, and somehow emerged not as a cautionary tale, but as a complicated heroine of sorts. Historians now recognize Pearl Hart as emblematic of the complex realities faced by women in the frontier West, the limited opportunities, the harsh consequences for stepping outside prescribed roles, but also the occasional spaces for reinvention and resistance that the frontier provided to those bold or desperate enough to seize them. Unlike male outlaws of the era, whose violent exploits were often romanticized into simple tales of rebellion against encroaching civilization, Pearl's story remained stubbornly complex. She was neither wholly victim nor villain, neither entirely independent agent nor helpless pawn of circumstance. She was, perhaps most accurately, a woman navigating an unforgiving world with whatever tools and opportunities came to hand. The last confirmed sighting of Pearl Hart was in 1928, when a journalist claimed to have viewed an elderly woman living in Arizona who admitted to being the famous Lady Bandit. She was reported to have said, "I've lived as a laborer, a hard rock miner, a coarse woman, and a lady. I do not care to be judged by any of them, but by the whole of who I have been." Whether these were truly Pearl's words or another embellishment, in a life story already laden with mythology, remains uncertain. What is clear is that her brief criminal career, a single stagecoach robbery lasting less than 30 minutes, secured her place in Western history far more effectively than decades of conventional living could have done. In the end, Pearl Hart's greatest achievement may have been her refusal to be forgotten, her insistence on being seen and heard in a society that preferred women to remain invisible unless they conformed to narrow expectations. In breaking the law, she paradoxically broke through barriers of gender and class that might otherwise have confined her to historical obscurity. From religious schoolgirl to desperate prostitute, from audacious bandit to prison celebrity, and finally to a woman who controlled her own narrative against all odds, Pearl Hart's journey embodied the contradictions and possibilities of the American West itself. Her story reminds us that history's most interesting figures are rarely its most virtuous, but rather those who challenge us to see beyond simple categories of hero and villain to the complex humanity beneath. Thank you for joining us for this remarkable true story from the American West. If you enjoyed learning about Pearl Hart, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Let us know in the comments which historical figures from the Wild West you'd like to hear about next.